Hello, I'm Dr. Ian Kenvin. I'm the co-founder of the Avexia Foundation. This is the second of 3 public workshops that we're calling Riding the Corona Coaster, coping with the ups and downs of life in times of the pandemic. And what I'm going to do now is to switch to my screen share and show you the shape of what we're going to be looking at. So bear with me one moment. There we go. Okay, so today is an online workshop looking at resilience. So as I say, I'm Dr. Ian Kenvin, and really at the end of today, we will be helping you to find your resilience. So as I say, this is a public workshop, and it could be 20 minutes that could change your life. It could also give you the knowledge to support or help somebody who's close to you. I'm the co-founder of the Avexia Foundation, and this work is all made possible with the support of the National Lottery Community Fund. Okay, so this is the shape of what we're going to be looking at over the next 20 minutes or so. Under each of those headings, there's more information. One of the things which you might find helpful is to have a notebook and a pen handy. Because there will be a point where you can press the pause button, maybe make some notes and ask and answer some of the sort of trigger questions that I'm going to present to you. Okay, I think we need to start off with a definition. And this is one that I found from Dr. Jane Thompson, which I think is as good as I've found anywhere. Resilience is the capacity to adapt and reorganize whilst undergoing change and stress without losing your essential self. So again, I think it's a really nice definition and one which I think is very relevant today. Okay, key fact, if you take nothing else away from this, take this away. You can learn to be resilient. You can learn to face challenge and adversity, but not be defined by those things. So what you do is you acknowledge the challenge or the stressor, you examine it with what I've called your objective compassion. Be aware of how that is having an effect upon yourself or an effect upon others. But one of the key things about being resilient is to understand the difference between things that you can change and things that you cannot change. And even for things that you cannot change, you definitely can change the way you think about them. You can change the way you think about the unchangeable. And that is the power of resilience. So what resilient people seem to find is resolve and energy to change their approach, to change the angle, to find out the things that do not work, but also acknowledge, yes, if you found something that doesn't work, maybe it is pointing towards things that can work. And resilient people take action. The idea of movement is energy. And once you're moving, you've returned the control to you, the individual, rather than simply being static, dead in the water might be another way of looking at it. So, key things. There are several key things that you need to have to be effectively resilient. Main one is get the facts. Do not project meanings that are interpreted or drawn upon ambiguities, assumptions, or pseudo communications. Now that's very important. It also means, and it has to acknowledge that communication is a dialogue. Is a dialogue. So if you are giving information and feedback, make it clear and accurate. If you are receiving information, make sure you have a clear understanding of what that is, and don't be afraid to ask for clarification. The other thing about resilience, particularly at the moment, is you need to try and understand your feelings and responses. In the first workshop on stress and anxiety, there was a really interesting model on looking at the stress container and how that can sometimes overflow. So have a look at it. It is available on our website, and the references there. Because if you can become more self-aware, if you can become more aware of when your stress container is getting near to overflowing, then you can mitigate the explosion, and ideally before you're swept up in an emotional wave. So, thing about resilience is that it's an awful lot to do with your inner dialogues. It's that kind of talking heads answer. So one of the things that I think would be very helpful would be for you to workshop this, by which I mean I'm going to read through these questions, but then if you press the pause button, because you'll be looking at this as a recording, and actually see if you can answer some of those questions for yourself, because they're highly personalized, but they do have relevance. So it's an opportunity to workshop your inner voices. Now, we all tend to have some level of inner dialogues, but have you ever really thought about what your inner dialogues are, what your self-speak is? Question for yourself. I mean, is there a default narrative or a dominant narrative? And if there is, what's it saying to you? Now, some cases, these dialogues are sometimes characterized as two competing voices, the irrational voice and the rational voice, the logical voice and the emotional voice, the inner higher selves and our baser desires. There's lots of ways you can characterize that process, but have a think about it and really try and get some analysis going on it. Because one of the things that's really important is, what is the narrative? Is the narrative predominantly about fear? Is it driven by shame or self-consciousness? Are you crippled by fear of being misunderstood? Are you crippled by fear of failure? Are you worried about or have fearful about being other, of being rejected? And it's a long list, but can you sort of think about, okay, what is the narrative? Or, now that's quite a negative sense of the narrative. Could the narrative also be more positive? Could the narrative be around curiosity? Could it be driven by why and how questions, the desire to understand, to learn? So really, give yourself a moment to kind of reflect and say, do you consider there to be a true voice and a false voice? And you might just want to broadly reflect upon the criteria for these value statements, because they are essential to your resilience. So hopefully you'll pause here, you make a few notes, and come back to me in a moment. Okay, so having looked at those inner dialogues, and I think what you get from me is the idea that actually you can use that inner dialogue in a constructive rather than a destructive manner. Another thing which is really helpful is an interesting model that we get from evolutionary psychology, is this idea of there being a default mode network. It's an interesting idea because it really takes in the idea of, well, what does your brain do when it's not actually tasked or engaged in conscious action? What's happening to your brain? It can also be linked to the concept of monkey mind. Now, again, we do have a whole presentation on taming the monkey mind, which is available on the Avexia website. It's worth having a look at, because the idea really is there that if you can learn to calm the monkey mind, how the what's called the chattering of that primitive part of the mind can shade out a more logical, a more mindful, a more analytical approach. So if you can control the monkey mind or calm your default mode network, you can actually become more resilient. So there's very interesting research that suggests that people who are more mindful, particularly those that meditate on a regular basis, tend to have a quieter default mode network. So they're less troubled with the background noise. They're less likely to be misled by that background chatter, and they can be more analytical and actually be more resilient. Because to be resilient, you need to respond to realities rather than fears or emotions. So when you can calm that default mode network, you can be in the present. You can be in the present, not dominated by the past, nor fearful for a future that's not yet happened. So maybe one of the things that might help in terms of understanding this idea of resilience is to try and think of, well, who are the practical exemplars? Who do we know that that represent resilience? You've probably got a list of people yourself, but I've pulled together a few people that are pretty famous, really. Emmeline Pankhurst, great example of somebody that faced enormous challenge but kept coming back, even though for Pankhurst and the suffragists it was a long time until they got the vote, but they did eventually. Jeff Bezos, the head of Amazon, or just about to step down head of Amazon, world's richest man, but by his own admission, when he started Amazon as a book finding organization in his garage, he got a lot of things wrong before he started getting things right. So again, a good example of somebody who has actually looked failure in the eye, learned from it, and catapulted themselves to great wealth and to great success. Maya Angelou, her life story is full of facing challenges which should have ground her down, but it didn't grind her down. It made her stronger. It made her the remarkable woman that she was. Jeffrey Dyson, like him or loathe him, a very effective engineer, and very effective, but he talks about taking an engineering approach to things. And once something has failed, you build it, you run it until it fails, you find out why it has failed, and then you engineer the failure out of it. And clearly he's been very successful on that. Another example of somebody that's shown great resilience, Nina Simone, again faced enormous prejudice at the time at which she was becoming established as one of the world's greatest singers. Kept coming back, would not refuse to be ground down. I once saw a very interesting talk by Steve Jobs, the founder of Apple Corporation, about how with Apple in the early days they got things wrong more often than they got it right. Again, good example of resilience. Rosa Parks, black woman who sat in a whites only area during the 60s in the United States, really started a movement that really has now resulted in a woman of color being vice president of the USA. Not sure Rosa, even in her wildest dreams, would have hoped for that, but showed great resilience. Malala Yousafzai, shot for being a girl in school in Afghanistan. Very resilient young woman. Finally, Chris Boardman, people tend to forget, but before the Barcelona Olympics, when Boardman won the gold medal on the cycle in the velodrome, Britain had not won a gold medal at cycling in the Olympics. And Chris Boardman, by his own lights, was not particularly good at sport, but decided he would have a go at schoolboy time trialing. And in his very first race, he came absolutely dead last. But he kept coming back. He was resilient, and eventually, Barcelona Olympics in the velodrome, won a gold medal. I think in terms of resilience, to go from being dead last in a race to being standing on the top of the podium at the Olympics with a gold medal around your neck, that's resilience. So What about you? Yeah, remember that definition. Resilience is the capacity to adapt and reorganize whilst undergoing change and stress without losing your essential self. Or as my nice little illustration says there, resilience is the courage to come back. So, failure. Failure is a success if we learn from it. Yeah, it's only failure if you fail to learn something from it. So next time you're faced with challenge, next time you're faced with something that feels like failure, take some headspace. Don't react immediately and emotionally. Pause. Look at this with a rational head on, not an emotional flare, but a rational head on. Get honest feedback, taken and given. So, you know, if you're in a position that you're facing a challenge which feels like failure, ask for some feedback. If you are in a position to be giving feedback, make that feedback clear and ambiguous. And basically, you know, if you want to be resilient, own the totality of it, the good and the bad, because everything is a mix of good and not so good. Okay, moving towards kind of large tips I want to give you. And if you're, as my illustration says here, if you're tempted to say, I can't, have the courage to add yet, because yet might be the strongest weapon in your arsenal in terms of being resilient. I think it may have a claim to being the most powerful three-letter word that exists. Yet accepts limitations, but it raises your aspirations. It lifts your horizon and prompts you towards a route map to get you to where you want to be. It gives you movement. You're not defined by what you cannot do if you engage with the power of yet. And that, I think, is an absolutely crucial message. Okay, so moving to the takeaway messages from this little workshop. It's okay to fail. It's okay to fail. It's only a failure if you fail to learn from it. Think about the examples of people out there. Think about, you know, how you can change the way you think about it. If something hasn't worked, find out why. It might be pointing you towards the things that will work. Nurture your self-worth. And don't let yourself, your inner demons, your inner speak, take your sense of self-worth away. And equally, do not allow anyone else to take that sense of self-worth away from you. It is yours. You are unique. You are special. You are resilient. Do take the emotional, the intellectual time and space to reflect and review. Don't react. Don't retaliate, and don't deflect. Don't try and blame somebody else. If something has gone wrong and it's your fault, admit it. Life becomes a whole load easier if you put your hand up and say, yes, I got that wrong, because there's no head-to-head argument there. One of the things which can get you through that first emotional reaction is the tip that we gave you in workshop 1 about breathing for headspace. Just have a look at that and think about how when you control your breathing, you can actually control the chattering of your monkey mind. You allow your rational mind to take over, and it allows you to engage the power of yet and the idea of really analyzing and understanding. If you have time, try to include some meditation in your life, because meditation will calm the default mode network. At the moment, the default mode network, background music to our lives, is turned up quite high. It's constant levels of anxiety because of coronavirus and all the issues that set around it. But if you can meditate, you can actually turn the volume down on that default network, the chattering of the monkey mind, and you can be more resilient. Next takeaway, make decisions on the balance of facts. Do not be dominated by your emotional responses. I'm not saying ignore your emotions, they're important and they can sometimes give you some important cues that you weren't consciously aware of, but equally do not be dominated by the emotions. The next one is the one I do keep coming back to, it's the power of yet. You know, if something hasn't gone right for you, say, okay, that hasn't worked. I can't do that yet. And work out that yet can actually give you resilience. It's your biggest weapon in your intellectual arsenal in terms of being resilient. And the other thing is that warm words, and all words, are too easy. You have to couple this with actions, even very small actions. The smallest step is the start of a journey. The longest journey starts with the smallest step. It's a Chinese proverb. Okay, so some further resources there for you. I've mentioned our Evexia website. There's a lot of stuff on there which you might find helpful. More broadly then, in terms of understanding resilience and mental health and well-being, the Mind Organization are very, very good. I've given you their links there to their tips for everyday living. The NHS, not only is it a wonderful organization for treating us at the moment, it's also a fantastic source of information. And I've given you the link there for understanding stress, anxiety, and depression. And finally, the link for the Action for Happiness, which is a really good organization and one which I'd commend you to have a little look around. Okay, I've been Dr. Ian Kendin. I hope you found that interesting. Thank you very much.